Jan, is it possible to sum up Czech history in a nutshell?
Well, we can always try. Let's start in the 14th century. That was the time when the Czechs had their first Holy Roman Emperor, Emperor Charles IV, and the country experienced quite a lot of economic and cultural development in that period. Then at the beginning of the 15th century, religious preacher and reformer Jan Hus, we can say, invented Protestantism. He was burnt at the stake for it in 1415 by the church. The Czechs were terribly offended and defied Europe for almost half a century thereafter. The 16th century was a period of religious tolerance between the Czech Protestants and the Czech Catholics. They lived in peace together, although the country was 95% Protestant. Then in 1620, the Czech Protestants failed in a rebellion against their new Catholic rulers, the Habsburgs, the Habsburg dynasty, and from 1620 onwards, for the period of darkness, as it is normally called, Bohemia, the Czech lands, became subjugated part of the Austrian and later Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the end of the First World War in 1918, the Austrian, or by this time Austro-Hungarian Empire, collapsed and an independent Czechoslovak Democratic Republic was created. That republic was destroyed by Hitler in 1938. In 1948, Czechoslovakia became a part of the communist bloc, and in 1989, communism collapsed. In 2004, the Czech Republic and Slovakia became members of the European Union. End of story.
So tell me more about the Czech national revival.
Well, the Czechs did it several times in their history. At the beginning of the 19th century, Austria was really a police state snooping after students. It was very difficult to get anything published, so the Czechs couldn't really take part in political activities. So they specialized in cultural activity. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the middle classes in Bohemia were mostly German. Czech language was retained primarily in the countryside. The intellectual discourse was in German and in Latin. And the Czechs, under the influence of Romanticism, paradoxically, obviously, German Romanticism, set about recreating their intellectual classes, their literature. They assiduously worked in the cultural sphere, and then in the year of democratic revolutions, 1848, there suddenly was a fully fledged independent Czech nation.
What was life like for the Czechs in the second half of the 19th century?
After 1848, after the failed revolutions in Central Europe, there was a clampdown, and what followed was a fairly nasty police state between about 1848, 1850 to about 1860. But then gradually even the Austrian authorities realized that actually running the country without democratic accountability breeds corruption and backwardness, and so slowly sort of beginnings of democratic institutions were set up in Vienna. And so it can be said that especially from the 1860s until 1914, the Czech lands actually embarked on a very positive development towards democracy. Then around the turn of the century, universal franchise was introduced. But what was really important was that actually civic society developed throughout the decades of the second half of the 19th century. A very long rule by Franz Joseph, the Austrian emperor, very similar in a way to the rule of Queen Victoria in the United Kingdom. Also, this was a period of a very stormy industrialization. The Czech lands within the Austro-Hungarian Empire were the most advanced, or one of the most advanced parts of the empire. However, there was a problem. Even though Czech MPs participated in debates in the Viennese parliament, the developments were marred by fairly strong nationalism on both sides. The Czechs felt besieged within Austria-Hungary, and they felt that the state wasn't their own. They felt fairly hostile towards the German population of the Czech lands, most of which had settled there since the 13th century. And the Germans did the same. So basically you had two communities, very strangely. Franz Kafka later on observed this, that you as a, say, Prague German grew in the same places as the local Czechs. You were totally familiar with the old town of Prague, for instance, but you had a totally different cultural background. The Czechs and the Germans kind of kept themselves apart up to a point, because there was quite a lot of intermarriage, there was some political cooperation, especially amongst the Social Democrats, but on the whole, one can say that even though there was quite a lot of civic development and much positive economic development in Bohemia in the second half of the 19th century, the discourse between the Czechs and Germans was marred by nationalism on both sides.
How did independent Czechoslovakia come into being?
Well, there was a professor of sociology who invented sociology at the time when it didn't exist as a subject, one Tomáš Masaryk. He taught at Vienna University. Later on, he also became an MP in the Austrian parliament. Towards the end of the 19th century, he became the center of a number of scandals in Bohemia. The press were out to get him because he defended Jews against anti-Semitism, and also he stood up against certain myths. He basically pointed out that the Czechs shouldn't believe in the authenticity of some romanticist documents which various Czech nationalists felt that they came from the 9th century or something like that. And at the beginning of the First World War, Professor Masaryk basically decided that the continued existence of the Czechs within the Austro-Hungarian Empire is no longer tenable, went abroad and with a group of collaborators tried to persuade international politicians that the Austro-Hungarian Empire should be broken up and that independent nation states should be set up on its territory. Masaryk came really into prominence later on in the war when the Czech legions, these were military units made up of defectors from the Austrian army. These Czech legions in Russia fought very courageously and actually for a time mastered the whole Trans-Siberian rail line. This was very important strategically for the Western Allies at the time when no other Allied armies were there, and Masaryk suddenly had a bargaining tool. So he was received by the American President Wilson, and the Americans and the Western powers basically agreed that Austria should be dismembered and that states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia should be set up. It has to be said that on the part of the Western powers, this was an act of expediency. They really wanted to destroy Austria-Hungary because it was an enemy. But for the Czechs, it was a occasion for incredible jubilation. After those 300 years, in October 1918, independent democratic Czechoslovakia was set up.
Were there problems between the ethnic minorities and majority population?
Well, the independent Czechoslovakia, as it was set up in 1918, had a serious problem because on the territory of Bohemia, there were up to 30% Germans, and these Germans were fairly hostile to the new state. And they actually tried, there were attempts in the first years after the setting up of independent Czechoslovakia to create separate German enclaves that would somehow be connected with the German-speaking regions in Austria or maybe Germany. And of course the Czechs nipped this in the bud, often with military force. There are different views. I mean, some views are pointing out that the new Czechoslovak state was actually they gave preference to the Czech nationality at the expense of all the other minorities, whether they be the Ruthenians in the east or the Slovaks in the east, Gypsies, or the Germans. But of course there was a problem because the Germans were hostile and they were fairly nationalistic, and so the Czech state did assume a kind of defensive attitudes towards them, which, looking at it, when we look at it from today's point of view, with hindsight, maybe wasn't totally democratic. From today's point of view, we would probably expect much more care about sort of ethnic minorities and all these kind of things. But on the other hand, Czechoslovakia was democratic. There were allowances made to other nationalities, but maybe the Germans especially felt that there weren't allowances enough. And the problem was these Germans were settled mostly in what they call the Sudeten regions, the border regions in the sort of north and west of the country. These were highly industrialized. After when the economic crisis came in 1929, it was these regions in particular that suffered in the economic crisis. In the then credit crunch, there was a lot of unemployment and a lot of unhappiness. And of course, unemployment breeds extremism. And when in 1933, Hitler came to power in neighboring Germany, most of these Czech Germans actually sided with Hitler and really worked towards the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. And basically they became a kind of fifth column, and Hitler used them to destroy Czechoslovakia at Munich in 1938. Munich Agreement, the debates took place in September 1938 in Munich. There were French and British politicians negotiating with Hitler. The Czech politicians weren't actually admitted into the negotiations. France and the United Kingdom had defense treaties whose purpose it was to protect Czechoslovakia, but actually they reneged on these defense treaties and gave over the border regions, which were militarily fortified, to Hitler, so that basically Czechoslovakia stood totally helpless on the rump of Czechoslovakia, and it was only a matter of time when Hitler swallowed Czechoslovakia, the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was on the 15th of March 1939, and turned it into the so-called Protectorate of Böhmen und Mähren. Slovakia became an independent fascist state.
How did the Czechs live under Nazism and communism?
In the first couple of years of Nazi occupation, the regime was fairly mild, and the Czechs thought they could get away with it. But then, of course, oppression hardened, and people kind of buckle when they are confronted with terror, when they know that if they say something in public they shouldn't, they will be shot. And so quite a lot of commentators are saying these days that the Czechs have learned, kind of taken on Slavish mentality, rather than confronting problems head on, they look even these days for sort of various roundabout ways of solving problems, and they're not particularly straight. It's not surprising, because those decades of oppression have left their mark. There was resistance against the Nazis during the occupation, but quite a lot of the people who tried to fight the Nazis were actually executed. In the middle of the war, Czech emigres organized a group of paratroopers who landed in Bohemia and actually staged what used to be an assassination of the Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, Reinhard Heydrich. This was a major news item at the time, and it really helped the Czech emigres' cause. Czech President Beneš lived in London and obviously was trying to persuade the Western authorities, especially the British, to recognize his government and to recognize that Czechoslovakia should be recreated after the war. This was no mean task. Until the very last minute, the British weren't convinced that there should be a new Czechoslovakia after 1945. But again, quite incredibly, Beneš managed it. After the end of the Second World War in 1945, there was a democratic interregnum for 3 years, and then in 1948 there was a communist coup d'etat in February 1948, and the first 5 years of Stalinism was particularly harsh. Again, I don't think people knew what was going to hit them. Nazi regime was racist. Communist regime was class-orientated, which meant that if you were middle class, you were ostracized. People from the working classes were elevated to positions of power. There was a lot of propaganda. People were... the most annoying thing under communism was that it was your legal duty to be enthusiastic in favor of the communist ideology. And if you didn't show appropriate enthusiasm, you were punished. And actually tens of thousands of people ended up in labor camps. Some hundreds of people were executed in the 1950s. Fortunately, Stalin died in 1953. Then there was a period of stagnation. But later on, in the second half of the 50s, and especially in the 1960s, the Czechs tried to humanize the communist system. And they did it, it seemed at the time, rather successfully.
Was life under the communist regime an unmitigated disaster?
Well, this is what anti-communists say these days in the Czech media, but of course it wasn't. It's much more complicated. It was a real horror to live under communism in the first, say, 5 years of communism after 1948 until 1953. But when there were those concentration camps and those illegal executions. Those show trials. But at the same time, even in this period, there were lots of people who were enthusiastic about communism, especially young people, writers, Milan Kundera, Ludvík Vaculík, Pavel Kohout, others, who really believed that by participating enthusiastically in the regime, they were going to create a utopia good for everyone. And it wasn't until they were in their mid-30s, later on, when they realized that actually they'd been duped. And rather than introducing a utopia, they turned their country into a colony of an imperial medieval power, the Soviet Union. And so they set out to dismantle this, to change it, to humanize the system. They did this in the 60s, certainly from about 1963. They tried earlier, from about 58, but there were various clampdowns. So from about 1963, they did it exactly the same way as they used to do it, as the Czechs did it at the beginning of the 19th century. Because political activity was banned, they concentrated on the cultural effort. And the period from 1963 is a period of marvelous advances flowering in literature, film. The Czech New Wave was created when the Czech state financed films critical of the communist regime. It's quite incredible. Fringe theatres, popular humour, rock music. And primarily, of course, the purpose of these things was to push open the door towards freedom. But on the other hand, what is particularly exciting about the material, the cultural material from this period, is that it has general meaning. It actually probes the human predicament. And it is really quite relevant. It's worthwhile for people to read or to watch these films anywhere in the world.
What do the Czechs think about the 20 years of post-communism that have passed since 1989?
When communism fell in November 1989, everybody was absolutely euphoric. Obviously, it was obvious from the demonstrations that people thoroughly hated the regime. The regime had become decrepit and basically decadent, and it was really oppressive. And certainly in the 70s and 80s, people felt very much that communism was discredited, and they just had to go through the paces to actually keep the pretensions. Nobody believed in communism anymore. So they were all very happy when all this fell. And they had high hopes. The Czech Prime Minister, the right-wing Prime Minister Václav Klaus, who modeled himself on Margaret Thatcher, promised them that Czechoslovakia would be absolutely affluent within a few years, that it would be richer than West Germany, and everybody hoped that this would happen, and actually thoroughly supported the new right-wing Prime Minister. But unfortunately, the situation was much more complex. As in many other post-communist countries, there were various shady deals, there was questionable privatization, which has kind of created a feeling of injustice amongst most Czechs. Most Czechs to this very day feel that, I mean, the cards were dealt out unjustly after 1989. Typically, if you see anyone who sees a millionaire in the Czech Republic, people usually think that that must be a crook, because you couldn't have possibly amassed affluence, wealth, by legal means. Anyone who is rich is regarded as a criminal, basically, which isn't very good for the kind of attitude of the people towards the country. Nevertheless, the country progressed economically relatively well, even though it isn't on the cutting edge of technological development. Primarily, what is very, very debilitating is that the Czechs on the whole really distrust their politicians. There even was an opinion poll in January 2010 which said that up to 80% of the current Czechoslovak population think that the current Czech politicians are less moral than were the communist politicians, which doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that the Czech would have loved to return to communism, even though there is quite a lot of sentimental memories still today. But it means that they are really disaffected when they see the arrogance of the politicians. Jiří Pehe, the Czech political scientists, have actually commented that there isn't really politics in the Czech Republic now, that political parties have been privatized and they do not take care of the interests of the people. But what they actually do, they trade in power and influence, which is very interesting. And many people in the Czech Republic now feel this. And judging, I've been carrying out some opinion polls amongst people in the Czech Republic. The thing that people are frustrated by most is that there is general unfairness, and it is very, very difficult to find rectification. It is impossible, or next to impossible, to go to the courts and to actually achieve a fair solution. So generally, the public is quite frustrated.
Thank you very much.